All right, good morning, my friends. We are going to be doing a lot of discussion today about our connections to the ocean. Now, we're going to be talking about how other things connect to the ocean. So, all this stuff behind me here, we're going to be exploring how they are connected to each other. We're going to be making some observations during our class today, but we're also going to be drawing our observations. So, if you're ready to draw, we got a lot of fun stuff happening behind us here. We're going to draw those things. So let's talk about an ecosystem, a food web. Those are interconnected. We kind of talk about both at the same time. Our little friend is coming to say hello over here. I love the eels. They look a little goofy and scary, but they're really, really interesting animals. What else have you seen in here? Let me step off camera real quick so we can make some more observations. Now, this is our webcam of our Blue Cavern exhibit. So whenever you really want to watch a local habitat, you can. This is on our website, and we're showing this to you so we can make observations about this space. What have you seen, or what did you notice in this space? We already talked about the big goofy eels. There's these other really large fish right here. What do you see on the fish? What colors are they? So colors are important. That's something that we'll come back to in a little bit, but let's keep thinking about what else do we notice in this space? Well, the webcam did change, and that's okay. So this is a new scene now, but it's the same space. What happened? We're comparing and contrasting. We're going to make a lot of comparisons while we draw today. Did you notice just the fish moving around? What about the leafy looking things behind me here? What are these? They look like plants. They're seaweed. Seaweed is a very important part of an aquatic or water-based ecosystem. Now there's a bunch of different types, aren't there? I see like 3 different colors of different seaweed back here. Ooh, what's this? Those are sardines schooling together. Now, the cool thing about an ecosystem is you can't just talk about the things that are alive, like the seaweed, the fish, all these fun little fish that are in here. We have to talk about the things that are not alive. Now, we don't mean something that has died. Hello, fish. We mean the things that were never alive. So that's a term we call abiotic. Don't worry about that. You don't need to have to spell it right now until you get to high school. But the things that are not living, like this rock, are still important to that ecosystem. How are rocks important to an ecosystem? I mean, they're fun to sit on. Sometimes the eels sit inside them. They live in the little cracks and crevices. But what do you notice about the seaweed and the rock? Are there seaweed in the sand right here? No, not really. The seaweed is living on the rock. Man, the rock is the home of that seaweed. This little part right there, that's called a holdfast. That is where the seaweed grows from. It's got a root-like structure that holds onto the rock. They aren't roots, though. They're not quite like a tree or a plant. They do the same job, so the seaweed does photosynthesis. Have you heard of photosynthesis before? Plants take energy from the sun, and they can turn it into energy internally, and they can use that energy for them to grow. Where do we get energy from so we can grow? Food. We have to eat. So we can't generate our own energy like a plant or a seaweed. We have to get energy from food, just like the fish in here. All right, so we have one relationship already. We have the seaweed or the algae, their type of algae, lives on that rock. Let's start drawing the non-living portion of our habitat. Now I'm going to go over to my camera over here with my special drawing board. I'm going to use some Expo markers because it's really easy for me to erase that. Whatever you're drawing with, let's start drawing some of the parts of our habitat that are not living so that we can build up from there. They're going to be the foundation. All right, let's go over to our camera. Now, this is my special drawing board. La la! That's me. All right. We're going to start. We got to draw the ground, right? So where do you want the ground to be? I'm going to say here. I'm going to just draw the ground. Whee! Put some ripples in there because it's sandy, you know. Sand moves around pretty easily. So there's the bottom. There's the ground. Okay, well, should we draw some rocks now? Yeah, we should. Where should we draw some rocks? I want a rock real big right over here. Big rock. Let's draw a little rock. Help hold it up. Little buddy. All right. So we got a nice big rock here. I actually want another rock right here. I'm going to draw it where it looks like it's kind of tiny in a different weird non-circular shape. It's just kind of a shape. And let's pretend it's in the background. So I'm going to make this little squiggle underneath it so it looks like it's sitting behind the other rock. So now we're making it three-dimensional. Ooh, I like that. All right. I'm going to make some other squiggies down here. Squiggly, squiggly, squiggly. I like squigglies. Squiggly, squiggly, squiggly. All right. So there's our sand and our rocks. Do we remember what sat on the rock besides us or a fish? What other thing was anchored to that rock? Seaweed, yes. All right, now seaweed is an algae. Algae is similar to plants. Remember, it does photosynthesis. It grows from the rock that it's sitting on way up. So here's some seaweed in the ocean. So seaweed isn't just like a tree, right? It's like, ooh, I'm seaweed. Ooh, I'm very flexible. Have you ever touched seaweed before? It's kind of gooey, slimy, but it is flexible. Very few types are really rigid and tough. There's a type of red algae that is kind of rigid and tough. But the brown algae is not. Now, it kind of looks green. You're like, that's not that brown. That's green. Well, there's a lot of different shades of greenish brown that the algae can be. They're just in a family of algae called brown algae. So this giant kelp here is very tough, and it's very good for the environment. So sometimes storms can break it off. You can still snap them, but they can take quite a lot of wave action. Look at how much it's surging and moving around. So it's flexible and bendy, but it's still strong enough to survive some gentle wave movement. Now, drawing seaweed can kind of be a challenge. So while I draw some seaweed, go ahead and send in some questions to my friend Stacy. You're supposed to be sending in some questions or observations to that document. You can help share what you would like to put into the diagram, but also some other observations you made and questions you would like us to answer. So I'm going to go draw some seaweed for a minute or two. If you have a moment to text in some questions through our document, go ahead and do so. All right. Now I have a green marker that I'm going to make some seaweed out of. Remember, it's kind of greenish brown, but I don't have seaweed colored expo. I just have green expo. All right, I'm going to make one right here in this crevice. And it's going to look like some noodles in a triangle mountain shape. Okay, noodles. Now, when I draw the seaweed, you can make it nice and straight like a tree, or you can make it squiggly. I'm going to go from the bottom up because that's how seaweed grows. I'm going to make it woo. And even the marker's being squeaky today. Wow. All right. So there's what we call the stipe, or a stem-like structure, okay? I'm going to start another one right here. Noodles in a triangle, all right? And let's make this one a little shorter. And you know what? For funsies, I'm going to add one right here, too. Fun seaweed. Jen loves seaweed. Jen is the one controlling the computer, so you can see all the pictures behind me here. Jen loves seaweed. Well, she loves algae in general, but seaweed is an algae, so it counts. All right. Now we have to draw the parts of the seaweed that are like the leaves of a tree. Let's go back to the video of the seaweed blowing around, and let's see what that looks like. So we drew the nice big stipe that holds it up. So if I were a seaweed, pretend you could actually do this too. If you want to get up and moving around this morning, let's pretend to be seaweed. So our middle section is the stipe, or the stem. What would these parts be? These would be kind of like the leaves, right? We call them blades on a seaweed. So a leaf on a tree is like a blade on a seaweed or an algae. Now they have kind of a teardrop shape But they also have this little float looking thing on here too. Now we might have a close-up picture of just a piece of seaweed that we can show you, and we'll try to find the little float. It's called a nematocyst. So here's the blade, this part right here. This has just air in it. It actually just captures air or releases gas into it, and that helps the seaweed float. So if the seaweed didn't have any of that gases in the little nematocyst right here, it would sink to the bottom. But seaweed needs to grow up towards the sunlight. It doesn't have the stem or stalk like a tree or a plant does, so it has to have that thing to help it float, and it can go way up to the ocean surface. Now we'll get to this little purple friend here in a little bit, but we wanted to show you what the blades look like. Now I'm going to go draw some blades, and ooh, Stacy's got some stuff coming into the studio, so let's try to draw some blades. Now this can be the tough part. You can draw teardrop shaped blades. I like to start out or choose where I'm going to put my little blade, so I'm going to draw a couple little starter points right here and just kind of alternate left, right, left, right, left, right, all the way up. All right, so I got my little starter point. Okay, now we do a little teardrop. Whoop, whoop, and then a little circle here for the nematocyst. Now, being left-handed, it's easy for me to do these on the left side. When I get to the right sides of all of my seaweeds look a little goofy, but that's okay. Our art is to help us make observations. Our art doesn't have to be perfect. But either way, it's your art. You can make it look as cool as you want it to. All right, so Joanna asked, can seaweed be eaten if cooked? Yes, it can. Actually, there's a good chance you've probably eaten seaweed before. If you've ever gotten the nori seaweed from the store, they kind of come in these little sheets, bigger than like a playing card. That's a type of seaweed. Nori is a seaweed, and it's on a lot of our sushi food items. The seaweed they wrap around parts of sushi is nori. Now, the giant kelp that we are drawing and we saw in the exhibit and in the ocean, you could just like munch on that if you wanted to. I know somebody that did just be like, yeah, it's food. I mean, you could eat it, but it's kind of weird tasting. I wouldn't eat it. But you could. Seaweed is edible. Now, Mrs. Aldave's class is asking, do fish leave eggs on algae? Yes, they do. Great question, because that's another relationship. We know the seaweed lives on the rock, but there's things that are related to the seaweed too. All right, let's go back to looking at Blue Cavern really quick. I'm going to keep drawing a little bit on here while we make observations about our seaweed, and we'll see what the fish are doing to the seaweed. So I think Stacy just stubbed her toe. I'm so sorry, Stacy. Your questions are so amazing. She was working so quickly to get them in here. All right, here's our big frowny football fish we call the giant sea bass. You gotta get out of the way so we can see the little fish. Okay. We can see some half moons and some opali, maybe. No, I don't think that's an opali. That one is a kelp bass. This one is a half moon. So let's look behind the giant sea bass. Remember, I'm going to keep drawing some seaweed on my drawing. Let's make some observations about what the fish are doing in Blue Cavern. Do they always swim around really fast like those sardines were? That sea bass really wants to say hello for you this morning. The sea bass are super friendly fish. Are all the fish doing what the sea bass do and just kind of stare into the camera? Not even. So some fish swim around a lot like that shark does, or the sardines did up there. And then some fish just kind of sit in the screen like a giant sea bass. Do you want to try doing your impersonation of a sea bass with me? Because we're going to draw them in the next part. Just sit there like... They're actually not grumpy. It's just the shape of their mouth makes it look like they're frowning. They're really, really into the camera. But you can actually see the orangish color right here. That's the light from the camera. And they look at it like, what is that orange thing over there? And they just get real close to the camera and stare at the camera all the time. Now, they moved and changed the camera a little bit, so they don't do this as much anymore. This is from our highlights from a couple of years ago. But this is what sea bass do. But you can see the other fish are just either sitting still by the kelp, He's sneaking up real creepily on me. Or they're swimming around in the open water. So we can draw, you may not have time to draw a bunch of sardines, but you can draw a bunch of sardines out in the open water of your habitat. And we can draw a couple of the little kelp bass that are in the seaweed. All right. So I'm going to go back to my drawing here while that sea bass has fun with the camera. My green marker is not doing as much as I was hoping. The green marker is fading. All right, so here's some kelp. Now, you can add a bunch of blades if you want to. You can keep adding blades wherever you want to onto your seaweed. So you can keep making such a beautiful thing as a kelp forest habitat. But remember we saw that little kelp bass hanging out. We saw that little kelp bass hanging out in the seaweed, right? So kelp bass have a very fish-like shape. And the easy way to draw fish is to start with an oval. So a lot of fish have this oval shape, almost like a smushed lemon. Okay, so here's a fish. Now, kelp bass also have a big triangle tail. And they have some spots on their body. There's a little eye. So that's a kelp bass. But we want to draw the giant sea bass too, right? So some fish live in the kelp. That's the relationship. They stay there. That's their space, their home. They can lay their eggs in and around the kelp. They may lay their eggs on the sea floor or in the rocks or by the holdfast, but some of them will put eggs in the kelp too. It just depends on the type of fish, size of the kelp, the species or type of kelp it is, and a lot of factors as to whether or not they put those eggs in the kelp. So that was a great question. Now, Ethan is asking, do all rocks in the ocean have seaweed? You know, kinda. Not 100%. There's definitely rocks that do not have any algae on them. But there's a lot of rocks that have some kind of algae. Not all get the big, tall, giant kelp like this, because the kelp forest habitat is a unique one. It only really exists in specific regions of the world. There's less space taken up by kelp forests than there are by probably coral reefs, because coral reefs can grow around lots of islands all over the equator or center band of the Earth where it's nice and warm. Kelp forest habitats really only grow where there's a lot of cold, nutrient-rich water and a very specific amount of upwelling. So not every time is there going to be a kelp forest habitat just because the water is cooler. So we have kelp forests here in North America. There's some in South America. There's a few in Europe, and there's a few around Africa and Australia. But it's not everywhere in those spaces. There has to be those very specific conditions for kelp to grow. So great question from Ethan about where seaweed and algae are in the ocean. But a lot of algae grows on rocks all over the place. It just may not be kelp, which is a very specific kind of algae. Now, Tiana and Janet are asking, would you like to add fish, seashells, and coral? Ooh, I would like to add more to our drawing. We're going to add some more fish. But let's talk about the coral. Remember, we just talked about kelp forests and coral are a little different. Now, there's this kind of middle of this diagram. If you're drawing a Venn diagram of things, there's a kind of coral that lives here in California called a gorgonian. Very cool little things. Gorgonians are a soft coral. So we think of other corals like the hard corals of a coral reef. They're very rocky. They don't sway and move around. They're just stuck. Gorgonians can move a little bit. They're kind of rigid, but not as flowy as seaweed, right? Well, gorgonians are a kind of soft coral, and they kind of look just like empty branches stuck together. I'll draw my best attempt at a gorgonian real quick while I think Jen's actually looking for a picture. I'm not sure we have a picture of a gorgonian, but that's okay. So if you wanted to draw like what would look like a tree without any branches, all right, this is basically a gorgonian. It's a soft coral, but it looks just like a leafless tree. And they get about, I think I've seen some about 2 feet tall. It really depends. They are delicate, so the ocean could break them pretty easily. A lot more easily than a seaweed. Now, Luke asked, can you plant seaweed? You know, people are working on this. That's a great question, Luke. A lot of people are concerned about the health of kelp forest habitats because They have specific conditions they live in. We said that. But something's happening to our oceans. Climate change can be an effect that will negatively alter the kelp forest. If the water's too warm, kelp can't grow. So, if it's too warm for the kelp to start growing, we don't get this huge structure, this base of our food chain and ecosystem to be there for things to lay eggs in, for fish to hide in. There's even a kelp fish. It's called a kelp fish. It's the color of kelp, and it hangs out, drop my pen, hangs out right on the blades, pretending to be part of the seaweed. Oh, Jen just found a gorgonian picture. So we'll show you what a gorgonian looks like. And Luke, more about planting seaweed. There's a lot of groups that are trying to help replenish that kelp forest habitat space. And by doing that, they're trying to grow kelp in like a laboratory setting, and then they put those rocks with kelp into the ocean. This is one from our friends at NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. This is not one I think that lives specifically to California, but this is a gorgonian. Now, if you zoomed way into our drawing, we could draw all the tiny little parts right here. That's where they filter feed out of the ocean. They filter feed their food, the little plankton swimming by. They just kind of grab it, and they start eating it, because each one of these little parts has a little mouth. So gorgonians are a colony of many things, many of one kind of animal, like a coral is. It's not like one big branch thing that's going to start putting all these different branches in its mouth. That's a very different kind of creature. But that's what a gorgonian would look like. All right, Isabel, does the seaweed hold any salt that is produced by the ocean water? That is a great question. There are some plants that can concentrate salts in their body, and they would live in a wetland habitat. As far as I know, seaweed doesn't concentrate or build up a high level of salt in its body, but it would be about the same saltiness as the ocean, because the entire space of the blade, and in a lot of places of the stipe, they can exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, just like we have to take a breath to do that. Or on a plant, it only does that on the leaves. On an algae, it can do that everywhere. It can also absorb nutrients from the water everywhere on its body. There's no roots, even though the holdfast looks like roots. They aren't true roots. So they're not sucking up nutrients from the ground and pushing them up to the top like a tree. They're absorbing them everywhere. So I don't think they concentrate salts, but that is a very interesting thought. There are some things that do build up salt in their body, and they have to expel it or excrete it in some way, or it just kind of reaches a certain limit. Penguins sneeze to get rid of salt. They don't live in the kelp forest. Well, the Galapagos penguin kind of gets close, but they don't really live in a space like this. But the penguins get too much salt in their body from their food and swallowing salt water that they get really, really salty boogers, and they have to snort them out. We have to blow our nose. That happens. And so does a penguin. They just don't have any tissues. All right. Nicole is asking, does seaweed change colors? Yes, it does. I mean, I've seen some parts of a type of brown algae that it almost has like this blue iridescent shade to it when it's in a certain lighting, but that's not really being caused by the pigments that are in the body. So we're dividing algae into either reds, greens, or brown algae based off of the pigment or color molecules that are in their body. But as far as I know, they're not color changing like an octopus or a squid. Now, red crustose algae will change color because the red is from the algae itself, but they have a crustose shell. It's a limestone. They actually kind of have a similar feature to coral does, where they will release a type of limestone structure in the body that will grow exactly like the leaves. It's not going to look like coral, but when the red algae dies, the red has gone away, or pink in many cases, and that crustose shell that was inside the blades is left behind. So it doesn't change color like an octopus, but when they pass away, when the plant or the algae will die, those things can change color. So that's the only way that I have heard of. All right, we have a few minutes left. So let's add some frowny footballs, not brownie footballs, frowny footballs to our kelp forest habitat. Great observations and questions from everybody. While we answer a couple more questions, I'm going to draw the big frowny football, the giant sea bass. Now, I'm going to draw my sea bass over in this corner because I didn't leave myself enough space anywhere else. So we're going to make a big lemon. Okay. Now, I didn't even leave space to draw the tail off of this way, but the tail, actually, you know what? Let's draw another frowny football right here. Frowny football. All right. Diego asked, how do you use seaweed to make biofuel? You know what, Diego? You asked a question I don't know the true answer to, but what I do know is that they grow what's called microalgae, and the microalgae can be used as a fuel source. So they're not taking seaweed like this stuff and cutting it off and then just like throwing it into a burner for an engine. They have to process it into something else. So they take microalgae, which is like the plankton in the ocean that makes the water color green or brown, and they take that and use that to make biofuel. So great question, Diego. Unfortunately, I don't know all about biofuels, but it's not from the seaweed that we see here. It's going to be something else. All right, so Jen just Googled part of it. They're fermenting it, which means they have to kind of let it decay and get a little gross. And the fermentation process will create that ability to create fuel. All right, so I made my frown on one of my fish. Let's make a nice big eye. And the other cool thing is that they have kind of rectangular spots on their body on a giant sea bass. So you can make some random assortment of giant sea bass spots. They have kind of a pokey mohawk right here, and then a fin. Now we'll try to transform our frowny football over here too while we answer some more questions. Now, some more information came in about the biofuel usage is that some of the algae are storing the energy as an oil in their body. So if you've ever heard of how whales were used for oils and fuels, it was the fat, the blubber in a whale that was then boiled into an oil, and they used that oil as lamp oil, which you could burn, and they used it for lubricants and other things. So the oils that they're creating in their body can also then be extracted and used as a fuel. Now, because it's not the most difficult thing to grow algae, if you've ever had a home fish tank, you can grow lots of algae. But it's a specific kind of algae, and you have to take care of it in a specific way. And then the processing of taking out the oils from there or fermenting different products, there's a lot of steps involved in it. It's not just grow algae, put it in your engine. It's a lot of steps. Now, biofuels and all of this technology is improving every year. There's so much coming out about it. So you could be a person that helps create a more sustainable future by creating more biofuels. So if you're really into that chemistry, or even if you like to be an engineer, you want to build stuff, learn how things work together in a machine. They need all sorts of different jobs in the biofuel industry and every science and technology industry, really. You could even be somebody that knows how to talk to other people about it, like what we do. We're educators. You could be a person that educates about that material. So there's a lot of different roles that you could have if you wanted to get into the biofuel industry. All right. Now, Miss, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I'm probably going to say it wrong. Miss Rangel or Ronhel's class, why does kelp end up on beaches if they are so strong? Well, that is a good question. You know what happens? A storm comes along and knocks it right off. Trying to draw a little fin here on my frowny football, and it didn't work quite as well as I hoped. So this is why erasers were invented. La, 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 la. All right. So there's that. Now what happens to the stipe is that it can break anywhere in the middle because really strong storm action can be strong enough to break it off. So if you ever think of like wind blowing in the trees, branches fall off pretty regularly because they're not quite as strong anymore, or the wind was just strong enough it could break off a healthy branch. Well, that happens to the seaweed too. So even though it's pretty strong and can sustain a lot of wave action, a strong enough storm can break it off. Now, other things eat it too. So it's not just that you see seaweed on the beach because a storm knocked it out. This part right here, the holdfast, is what urchins love to eat. So the last thing I'm going to show you today, because we just ran out of time, is that purple pokey doodad. And we're going to show you what that little guy looks like. So let's show you what a purple sea urchin is. and they eat seaweed and kelp. So it's this thing. They live all over kelp course habitats. If there's too many of them, they eat too much kelp and it all floats away. Now, the kelp, as long as it's not on the beach, is actually still alive. Remember, it's not a tree, so it doesn't need the roots to survive. If it's free floating, it can still do photosynthesis, collect nutrients, release oxygen. It doesn't have to be anchored to the ground. So that's nice for the kelp, but unfortunately, remember, if they eat it all, if there's too many of them and there's no more kelp, that home for a lot of other things is gone. So we want there to be enough animals in the ecosystems, but not too many or too few for it to be balanced, so that everybody has a job and they're all able to do that job in the ecosystem. So they might prevent too much algal growth, but then if there's too many of them, then there's not enough algae growth. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I really appreciate you tuning in. Keep adding stuff to your drawings. I didn't even get close to finishing mine. And if you would like to, you could always have your teachers send us some examples of your beautiful habitats that we drew and made observations with together. Thank you so much for joining us from our LA Unified School District friends. We really appreciate you, District East, and we'll see you on future classes. Thank you.